Peter has told me that you've been reading lots of articles about Stonehenge and that you're all going to want to ask questions afterwards. Is that correct? So don't be shy about asking questions. If you think, oh, that's going to sound terribly stupid, just ask, because I'm sure it won't be stupid, even if you think it might be. So, okay. And am I right that you have actually been reading? Some of you. Okay, well, that's good. Yes. Now, I'm going to be talking about work that we've been doing at Stonehenge for 10 years now. And I think we've left the state of knowledge in a very different position to when we first started. Of course, Stonehenge is one of those sites that people have always been excavating at over the last 100 years. So the first modern excavation was carried out there in 1901. So that's over 100 years ago. And then there was a major program of works in which almost half of the site, the eastern half, was dug up in the late teens and early 1920s. And then from 1950 until the late 70s, there was a third campaign led mainly by a man called Richard Atkinson, but also with the archaeologist Stuart Piggott, that I expect some of you will have heard of. So it's suffered because each group of archaeologists, apart from the very first, seemed incapable of publishing their results. They dig it up and then decades go by. But finally we're now in a situation where all of that work is published, and we've been working, and now my job is to publish as well. So there is now a small book published, and this is actually the free copy, special copy for Peter, to thank him for inviting me. But we're also working on 3 big technical excavation reports from our work. Now, I wasn't going to ever dig at Stonehenge. I never wanted to go and work there, because I don't know if you've noticed, but around the world there are all sorts of people with the strangest ideas of what Stonehenge was for. And there are also people who think it is their own temple. So in Britain we have some 4,000 people who have registered themselves as Druids, and they think that this is their Druidic temple. So it can be quite difficult if you want to have anything to do with Stonehenge. And of course it has a lot of legal protection. It's a World Heritage Site. It is also protected as a scheduled monument, and it is seen as one of the most special, most carefully protected sites in the whole of Britain, if not in Europe. So I really didn't think I was going to do anything with Stonehenge. And in fact I went as far as I possibly could from Stonehenge to do my research, which was Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. And it was there that I was interested in looking at burial traditions, not just in the present day, but also in the past. And while working there, I was lucky enough to work with, I think, the person who is probably the luckiest man in the world. This is him, Ramilson. He's a Malagasy archaeologist, and he's retired now. And I don't know how he did it, but when I first started in Madagascar, we were in a general strike. Everything was closed and shut, and he just said, "Don't you worry. If you're with me, we will be all right." And he was absolutely correct. So somehow, wherever we went, he managed to make things happen. He managed to make people like him. He managed to get petrol where there was no petrol. And I realized that I had never met anyone so lucky before. And he brought his luck with him when he came to Britain in 1998, because I thought I must show him Stonehenge. And we also went to the stone circle at Avebury as well. The reason I wanted him to see was because we'd been researching standing stones in Madagascar big stone tombs as well, and his family puts up standing stones and builds stone tombs. So I thought he'd be particularly interested to see Stonehenge. And he said, "Whoa, that's amazing. Did they have tractors?" And I said, "No, there are no Stone Age tractors. Then they must have put it up by magic." And he said, "Also, there's something really important, which is what it's for." And I said, "Well, we don't know what it's for." And he looked at me like I was stupid. And he says, "How do you not know? Have you learned nothing from working for 10 years with me in Madagascar? It is obvious. It is built for the ancestors. Because, of course, in Madagascar, you build in stone, you put up a standing stone as a commemoration of the ancestors. You build tombs in stone for the ancestors because they are dead for eternity. So they need something built that is permanent. Our lives are transient. So, of course, we have traditionally houses in wood because we're only going to live there 50, 60, 70 years. But the tombs and the monuments for the dead, they have to be built out of permanent materials. So I thought, yeah, but how does that really work? This is Madagascar today and in the last few hundred years. Does it have anything at all to do with Britain 5,000 years ago? So I thought about it and I realized that there was something quite interesting that we hadn't really thought about in Britain, which was that as well as the stone circles like Stonehenge, we have a whole series of timber circles. And the most famous group of them are only 3 kilometers away along the River Avon that you can see in this picture here. At this place, Durrington Walls, the most famous of them is called Woodhenge, but there are also 2 that we've known about inside Durrington Walls that were excavated in the 1960s, the Southern Circle and the Northern Circle. So we formulated a theory and we published it in the journal Antiquity in 1998, which set out the proposition, the hypothesis, that Stonehenge was for the ancestors and that this group of timber circles was contemporary with Stonehenge, a fact that wasn't appreciated at the time, and that it would be associated with the living, and that these were 2 halves of a complex connected by the river. And that whilst we knew we had an avenue connecting Stonehenge to the River Avon, we hypothesized that there should be another avenue connecting Durrington Walls to the river, and that the river was the conduit, the bridge, if you like, between the living and the dead. And we published this paper, and we had extraordinarily different reactions. Some people said, "Wow, that's really exciting. That's really challenging. We've got a new perspective." Others said, "You must have been having a very bad day, Mike, because that's the worst thing you've ever published." But it was interesting that the reactions were so extreme, because when that happens, you think, aha, there's an issue here, isn't there? But the most exciting thing for me was that we had predictions. We said, okay, we should be looking for evidence that Stonehenge has remains of the dead, that Durrington Walls is indeed associated with the living, and that there ought to be an avenue at Durrington Walls leading to the river. So I thought, okay, well, I'm only an ordinary archaeologist. There are more important archaeologists who have their names associated with Stonehenge, and they'll want to go and do a project there to see if our hypothesis is in any way close to reality. So I waited 4 years and nothing happened. We had arguments about archaeological theory. I expect you all love archaeological theory. But it came to the point where I realized that we were just arguing back and forwards without any capability of resolution, using the same old facts, and in fact facts that we later discovered were not facts. They were based on invalid assumptions and poor research once we'd got started. So it was a good thing that finally I thought, I'm going to have to do this myself. So I invited a team of colleagues from different universities. Some of them you may have heard of: Julian Thomas, Chris Tilley, Colin Richards, Josh Pollard and Kate Wellham. And we formed a big kind of syndicate, a big group of universities bringing students of our own, and students also came from different parts of Europe to take part in the project. And over the next 10 years, we worked not only in this landscape, but also, as I'll say later, working much further afield, looking at, for example, where the stones for Stonehenge came from. The period we're looking at is what we can now consider to be the late Neolithic and the Copper Age, and into the early Bronze Age. That is really when Stonehenge was constructed over a series of 5 different stages. So the first stage shortly after 3000 BC, the second stage around 2500, and then the next 3 stages between 2400 and 1600 BC. If you don't know where Stonehenge is, it's about there. And zooming in a bit closer, it is located on an area of high ground made of chalk, which part of which is known as Salisbury Plain. That is the bit where Stonehenge is, up here. But that includes a series of monument complexes from Avebury southwards. So these are centres that have origins in many cases going back at least 1,000 years to the early Neolithic, where we have causewayed enclosures, long barrows and other Neolithic monuments. And it was generally thought that this was where settlement was concentrated, but of course recent research has shown that actually most people at this time were living on either side of the high ground, in the lowlands, in the valleys, rather than actually up on top of the dry chalklands. And that in fact these ceremonial complexes appear to have been between the territorial groupings. So these were actually where people were likely to meet, coming from different parts of the country. Why is Stonehenge so famous? I don't really know, but it's the stone circle which is the best known anywhere in the world. It is unique amongst stone circles because its stones are shaped or dressed. Also, the stones had lintels on top of them, so we have an arrangement near the centre of 5 trilithons, pairs of uprights with a lintel on top, and then we have an outer circle with lintels. Also, the stones come from different places, so that the big ones with the lintels, the trilithons and the outer circle, these are made of Sarsen. It's the local name for a type of sandstone, and it's a sandstone which is found in the vicinity of Stonehenge, but is most common about 30 kilometres to the north. And then it also has these smaller stones in here, which we'll say a little bit about later, which are known as bluestones, except they are green. But they have come to be known as bluestones, and they come from a very long way away. They come from 250 kilometres. So that is all the way to the west coast in Wales. Stonehenge is also famous because it has a series of astronomical orientations, the most famous of them being down the avenue towards the northeast. In this direction, towards the midsummer solstice sunrise. So that's on the morning of the longest day of the year in June. And today, over 30,000 people will go to Stonehenge on the longest day of each year to wait for the sun to rise. Of course, they never see the sun because it's England. The weather is always bad. It's always cloudy. I think it was probably at least 10 years ago since anybody last saw the sun rise at Stonehenge on the solstice. But there's another, perhaps, well, as we now know, more important direction, and that is actually in the opposite direction. If you turn round 180 degrees and you look towards the southwest, what would have been through the Great Trilithon, between the two uprights of the Great Trilithon, you would be looking at where the sun sets on the shortest day of the year, on the midwinter solstice sunset. There are all sorts of other claims made for Stonehenge about lunar orientations, about anything you care to think of. Some of them are a little bit strange and off the map, but I get letters about these things almost every day with people's unusual theories. Perhaps the most prevalent theory of recent years has been that Stonehenge is a temple for Druids. And as I mentioned, Druids are now a recognized modern-day religion in Britain, and many of them consider Stonehenge to be their temple. And this really goes back to a theory by a man called William Stukeley, and this is a drawing by Stukeley from 300 years ago of what he thought one of these ancient Druids would be like. Now, Stukeley was a clever man, and he was able to work out that Stonehenge was older than the Romans, that it belonged to prehistory. But of course, 300 years ago, prehistory was thought to be a very short period of time. His only guide to prehistoric Britain was Julius Caesar, writing in his book De Bello Gallico, on the Gallic Wars, in which he describes his invasions of Britain in 55 and 54 BC. And in that he talks about Druids as religious and judicial officials within ancient Britain. So Stukeley said, well, look at Stonehenge. It looks like one of those Greco-Roman temples from the Mediterranean. So it must be a temple. If it's a temple, who are the priesthood who are going to have worshipped in there? It must have been the Druids. But he couldn't possibly have known that Stonehenge was built 2,500 years before Caesar and the Druids. But it has stuck, and it has become one of the most popular theories, along with the idea of Stonehenge as a prehistoric observatory or astronomical calendar. Now, our project that I mentioned, the Stonehenge Riverside project, was concerned with excavations in the Stonehenge area up until 2009. Subsequently, we've been involved in the Feeding Stonehenge project, not just processing our results, carrying out the scientific analyses on our finds, but also looking at the overall issue of where did everybody and everything come from to build Stonehenge? Was it actually built locally? How far did people come to join in building Stonehenge? What kind of resourcing did it require? There's also a third project that we've lost at the bottom, I'm afraid, because I don't use Mac, which is the Stones of Stonehenge project, which we're currently on at the moment, and we're looking at the sources of all of the stones. Where did they come from? How did they get them there? Why did they want to go all the way to Wales to bring half of the stones? So our Stonehenge Riverside project, we've excavated 42 trenches within the World Heritage Site of Stonehenge. This is just some of them, and you can see we've looked at many different monuments I'm not going to talk about most of these, or we will be here for 6 hours. I'm just going to tell you about the interesting bits. So if you're interested in the cursors, sorry, you can ask me a question about it afterwards. How about that? But otherwise, we're going to have to keep to just a certain number of sites. Questions about Stonehenge. What we're looking at here, this is the main plan, pretty much as it was constructed, not in the first stage of building around 3000, but actually around 2500 BC. And it's always represented, but one of the big questions we've had, was it ever finished? And some archaeologists have said no, they made a start, but then they stopped because they got bored, they ran out of stone, or whatever it might be. But we had a piece of luck this year because we had a very dry summer. Did you have a dry summer here? And no. And it was so dry that when English Heritage, they normally water the grass to keep it nice and green, but their hose pipe was too short. So they weren't able to water the entire extent of the monument, as a result of which somebody noticed parch marks where the grass had dried because of underlying pits here, 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 and here. In other words, the area on the southwest of the monument, so that's round here, there had indeed been holes dug to hold stones. The stones we now think have presumably been toppled, broken up and taken away. So it looks as though a short hose did what years of geophysical survey had failed to do, which was to reveal that actually there almost certainly was a full circuit of stones. Now I mentioned the little stones inside the monument, and today they form an outer circle here, the Welsh bluestones, and also a little horseshoe array within the centre. A lot of them have been destroyed in the ancient past, but some survive, still standing. There's one. Although they're called bluestones, we've got about 43 out of maybe 80 originals, and they're made of all these different types of rock. Now, the ones that are most frequently talked about are the spotted dolerites. So these are volcanic rocks which have small spots of quartz within them. But as you can see, there's other kinds. There's sandstones, there's rhyolite, and there are various sorts of volcanic ash. Now, we think that the vast majority of these, possibly except for the sandstones, come from a very limited part of Britain, and that is just off our picture in the Preseli Mountains, where the arrow is pointing at. Whereas the Sarsens come from much nearer, the area that we think of as the Marlborough Downs. Now, we've been very lucky because we're working with some very talented geologists, Richard Bevins and Rob Ixer, and what they've been able to do is to identify for the first time two of those sources, for the spotted dolerites and for the rhyolites. So how good's your geology? Do you know the difference between a dolerite and a rhyolite? So they're both forms of magma extrusion coming out from the magma kind of core, and the rhyolite is like a kind of lava which then solidifies in a sheet. Both of them, in the right conditions, will form these long, thin pillars as they're pushed and extruded through. And these were formed 482 million years ago on what was then the bed of a deep ocean. And what our geologists have been able to do is a brilliant piece of detective work. They have been able to identify for one of the rhyolites not just the outcrop where it came from, but the exact location on that outcrop. and in this picture it's right at the top, location 8. So they can take one of the types of bluestone at Stonehenge, and through geochemical and petrographic investigation they've been able to show that it's not just this one outcrop in the small valley to the north of the Preseli Mountains, but it's specifically from one location. So an extraordinary piece of work. And they're very lucky because it's to do with the unique pattern of folding and fracturing that the rock has gone through, as well as the unique mineral constituents of this particular rhyolitic outcrop. They've published all their results, but what we've been doing for 3 years is excavating there to look to see what was there at that source. So the point in question, I'll use the pointer for this, is right here. But while we were excavating, we discovered that there was a megalith that they'd left behind. This is the recess, this is where that megalith was taken from. So it's a small one, it's only about a ton. And in fact, most of the bluestones seem only to have weighed between 1 and 2 tons, most on average around 2 tons. So in this room, we could be pulling 2 of them easily if we all got together with some ropes. Do you fancy that? We're still investigating this source, but it's raised some interesting issues because it's on the wrong side of Preseli. It's always been thought that the stones came straight off the mountain to come down this route in red to Milford Haven. That no longer seems likely because we're up here on the top side. Either you take them by sea round here, or you could go by land. If you go by sea, you've got to decide here whether you're feeling a little kamikaze and going to go all this way around Land's End, some of the most dangerous waters of Britain, or if you just take the chicken route and just sail up this river, which is also called the Avon. This is the Bristol Avon as opposed to the Wiltshire Avon here. We're wondering, in fact, whether it might even have been better for them to take them this way along the Welsh valleys and then just transport them across the quiet water on some kind of a raft across the Severn estuary. I don't think at the moment there's any way of knowing, and who knows whether we'll ever get an answer to it. One of the points that my colleague Colin Richards has made is that where we have observed monument megalith moving around the world in contemporary societies, it's always a spectacle. It's a ceremonial occasion where people join in, people come from all over to see and be part of these things going on. So he was saying that it might have made more sense to actually take the stones by land as far as possible. And of course, it avoids all the absurd risks of taking them round some of the most dangerous waters in the British Isles. Well, who knows? What about those Sarsens? So these are the big ones, and although many of them look a bit rough, they've all been dressed. They're big. They're 20 tons or more. And we think they have come from 30 kilometres to the north in the area of Avebury. And at the moment we're investigating a location halfway between Avebury and Marlborough, just off our map here, a place called Clatford. And the reason for that is because 11 years ago a researcher working in the Bodleian Library in Oxford discovered a missing, lost drawing by our friend William Stukeley. He painted it in 1723. And it's a group of some 12 stones beside the River Kennet. So that is just here. And he noticed that they were shaped. And he said these must have been destined for Stonehenge, because that's the only shaped Sarsen monument. Were they unnecessary? Was it too difficult to get them across the river? We don't know. But having found this, we can actually locate the very place. And there's nothing there, because they were broken up, we think, and this farm here is made of big blocks of sarsen. So we think that that's where they ended up. But what we're going to be doing is looking in this area to see if we can find any trace, and whether, of course, they made any arrangements to get them across the river. Was there some sort of causeway there? Now, William Stukeley was very interested in this question of where the stones came from, and he had a little pocketbook that he wrote a lot of his observations in. And 300 years ago, this was a very different landscape, covered in sarsen stones. They had not yet been broken up to make walls, roads, hedges for fields and so on. So he saw a lot that, of course, has long since vanished. And this is the point that he talks about where the stones were at Clatford that I've just mentioned. But he said just up on the hill above them lies a great stone upon 3 lower in the way to Stonehenge from the grey weathers. So he has a strange old-fashioned way of speaking English. So what he said, there's a great stone put upon 3 other stones on the route to Stonehenge, and they've come from this place called the Grey Weathers, and that's up in this part of the map, right up on the high ground. And he says about there that from the Grey Weathers, all Stonehenge's stones seem to be fetched. They appear to have come from. For the holes yet appear whence such were drawn. The holes are still there, that they appear to be pulled out of. Now, until this summer, nobody had ever gone to look. And that may seem crazy. So we did. And these are 2 of my colleagues, Andrew Fleming and Dave Field. And we discovered that where Stukeley was talking about, you get this, what we call tabular sarsen. So not the kind of gnarled, broken up bits that you find in the valleys, but up on the tops where it is less weathered or eroded. And in one location, we found what may be a very large quarry, 100 meters long, 30 meters wide, with these big tabular blocks sticking out of the side. So just possibly, this could be one of the locations, but that's going to be for future research to decide. And if we don't go there next summer, we'll go hopefully the year after. Now, these big sarsens, of course, were used to build the second stage of Stonehenge. So this dates to somewhere around 2500 BC. If you like your radiocarbon dates, I've put at the top there the calibrated date to within 95% probability. So it's basically a range that we can tie it down to. Now, that's the second stage. The first stage is rather different. It's a bank and a ditch, and we have a whole series of lots of holes for both stone and timber. So there were posts and there were standing stones. We know that some of those standing stones were sarsen, but what we've recognized recently is that the circle of pits around the interior of the enclosure, 56 of them, known as Aubrey holes, that these are actually the same size and shape as stones, holes later within stage 2 of Stonehenge that now hold bluestones. So we think that actually the bluestones were set up here sometime after 2990 BC, but before 2755 BC. So somewhere around 2900 BC. So when we get our radiocarbon dates in a few months' time from our excavation in Wales, we will know if we're right or if we're wrong. So that will be, for me, very exciting. Are they going to be just before this period, or are they going to be after, to show that our theory is wrong? So this is just a comparison, depth by width, of pits that contain bluestones at Stonehenge today. So these are the triangles and the squares, and in fact they're in exactly the same area as the little diamonds, to show that from the Aubrey hole dimensions, to show they are effectively the same shape and size. And in fact, one of the early archaeologists, he noticed that they had held stones. He dug over 20 of them. Since his time, we've only ever been able to dig a couple. So, as he said, there can be little doubt that they once held small upright stones. Now, Stonehenge's landscape is full of monuments of lots of different periods, but one of the things that we wanted to do was to find out what sort of connections there might be along the river. So in 2007, we carried out a trial excavation here at the end of the Stonehenge Avenue. We tried geophysics of all kinds, couldn't really see anything. But when we put in a trial trench, we found that we had a small henge right at the end of that avenue. It's come to be called Blue Stonehenge because within the henge bank, so here it is, running like so, there was an earlier structure, a series of intercutting pits, each one with a ramp, and we could see that the ramp had been used to put in an upright and then to take it out again. And we could also tell from the shape of the upright of the pits and of the voids caused by drawing these out, that these were not wooden posts, they were actually standing stones. And they're too thin to be Sarsen. We think they have to have been blue stones. So we're looking at perhaps in the first stage of Stonehenge, some 56 in those Aubrey holes at Stonehenge, and then maybe another 24, 25 of them in this smaller monument down by the river. And it might have looked perhaps something like that. Now, a lot of our research has focused on the landscape, and I suppose one of the key issues that people have asked is, well, why build Stonehenge there? Why is it in that location specifically? And what is all this business about the solstice? Why is that direction so important here? And we may have some answers to that. And the thing about Stonehenge is that it's in a very odd situation. Has anybody been to see it? Not many of you, one or two. Well, if you do go, wait until the new visitor centre is up and running. Don't go this December when it opens. Go in the summertime when it will be nice, but they'll also have some reconstructed houses for you to see. Anyway, back to Stonehenge. It's a very odd location. It's not on a hilltop, it's not in a valley, it's on a north-facing slope. Doesn't look a very promising location at all. And if you really wanted to put it somewhere, up here on top of the hill behind it would actually be perhaps the most likely location. Now, the funny thing about its orientations is that we know about the avenue and its solstice axis, we know about the main axis through Stonehenge, but there's a whole series of other henges with timber monuments inside them that also have solstitial alignments. There's Woodhenge, there's the northern and southern circles within Durrington Walls, there's one we've discovered to the south of Woodhenge, and there's another one here called Conybeare Henge, which are all aligned primarily towards midwinter solstice sunrise. Not entirely, but primarily so. And it may well be that the reason for this was something that we stumbled across in 2008, when we excavated across the avenue in front of Stonehenge. And the avenue is simply formed by two ditches. You can see one of them here, which runs all the way up to Stonehenge there, and another one here. And these had small banks on the insides of them, there and there. But what our geomorphologists were able to tell us is there's something very unusual about the ground in between those two ditches. And first of all, it is that we have a series of trenches aligned on the solstice. And we'd seen these from the results of an earlier excavation in the 1950s. And they were dismissed, I thought, as natural features. And I thought, it's not possible. Aligned on the solstice axis, natural features can't be. They must be cultural, surely. But when we excavated, we were proved wrong. They were indeed natural features. So these form in conditions of freezing and thawing in tundra-like environments to the south of an ice sheet within Ice Age conditions. So likely to have formed about 25,000 years ago. And the ridges on either side of this will have served to concentrate water down this slope to create those features, which then fill up with periglacial deposit. So what we wondered was whether actually Stonehenge is constructed at one end of a natural, a geomorphological feature, which by total coincidence happens to align on the solstice. And this August, we were very lucky to have an excavation carried out as a commercial contract for English Heritage. I didn't do the excavation myself, a commercial company did it, by taking up the tarmac along the road here as part of the new arrangements for the visitor centre. And they absolutely confirmed our geomorphologist's observation that within the two ditches of the avenue, here are those periglacial stripes running on that solstice axis, and there aren't any outside of them. So this raises a really big question. Are they actually taking a special place in the landscape where apparently the earth and the heavens seem to be linked in some extraordinary way? More than that, when was this spotted by humans? When did they recognize it? And the most amazing thing about Stonehenge is that it's the earliest example of monumentality anywhere in Northern Europe, because just a little away from it, under what is now the car park of the visitor centre, we have the remains of posts a metre in diameter that were put up 10,000 years ago. That's in our early Mesolithic. Now, we've always thought that farmers were the first people to build monuments in Northern Europe, or at least on the interface between farming and hunter-gatherers. This proves all of that wrong. Why are they here, so close to Stonehenge? And we also have a radiocarbon date now as a result of excavations in Stonehenge in 2008, a piece of charcoal from the same date as those. So it's most likely there was something happening within the area that is now Stonehenge at the time that the posts were going up. So it raises the possibility that in the early Holocene, when soils were very thin, that someone may have noticed that this was a special place. Now, until recently, we thought, well, this is kind of odd because we've got no Mesolithic finds to speak of from the Stonehenge area. So those are these post holes, 3 of them. There's a Mesolithic pit nearby. But what recent research has shown is that actually it may have been a major centre for Mesolithic activity. So not only have we found Mesolithic flints, hang on, here and here. We've got our Mesolithic dates from this group of features, from Stonehenge itself, but we also found Mesolithic flints down at Blue Stonehenge. And there's a new excavation being carried out by someone else, David Jakes, and the Open University, where they have a thick Mesolithic layer, 2 small trenches, and they've got 30,000 Mesolithic flints. They've also got 4 radiocarbon dates from this single deposit spanning between the 8th and the 5th millennia BC from the same location. Now that's unheard of in Britain. I don't know if you have similar sites like it here in Belgium, but otherwise our longest lived sites in Britain are places like Starcar, which lasted 1,000 years. There is the potential that this was a persistent place for 5,000 years throughout the early Holocene. And one can perhaps understand why. It appears to be a lakeside settlement in a valley, densely vegetated, but then you've got above it an area of high, dry grassland, an area that never turned back into full forest. So it's an ideal location for herds and for hunters. So it may be in such conditions that people actually saw that strange geomorphological feature, and that it became a kind of focus along with the rich resources of this bit of the Avon Valley for people to meet over thousands of years. So it raises the possibility that actually the Neolithic Stonehenge has locational roots going way back into the Mesolithic, something that we've just not wanted to think about at all. Now, we've talked a little bit about what's happening down at the river. Let's go up to Durrington Walls. This is the largest henge of anywhere. And it's been dug into over the last 100 years. The main excavations happened in the 1960s when a modern road was blasted straight through the middle. And the largest ever excavation at that time was carried out. It's one of the earliest uses of the mechanical excavator in British archaeology. And they found the northern circle and the southern circle, and they excavated out this part of an enormous henge ditch, 5.5 meters deep, 10 meters wide, and in all a circuit of over 1 kilometer in length. So it's quite a stupendous monument. It would have looked something like that. And of course, it's what archaeologists regard as a true henge, in which the bank is outside of the ditch. So it's as if you're trying to keep something in. Very different to Stonehenge, which has the bank on the inside of the ditch, as if you're trying to keep something out. So we have 2 rather different definitions of Stonehenge, I'm afraid, just to make of henges, just to make matters complicated. The southern circle may have looked like this, and now that we've been able to get the entire plan of it by not just the rescue excavation from the 1960s, but our own research excavations and our own geophysical and radar survey, we can see that in its second stage it's very much a timber version of what we see at Stonehenge, with a slightly different orientation. Instead of towards the midwinter sunset, it's oriented towards the midwinter sunrise. And from it, there leads an avenue, which we have in half section here, running down the valley. And this is an avenue, 30 meters wide with a metalled surface, 15 meters wide. What's interesting is that this prepared surface lies on top of a natural surface. In other words, it's actually sat on a naturally aligned avenue, again thinking of the one at Stonehenge, but in this case it's not aligned towards midwinter sunrise, it's actually going the other way. So uphill, aligned towards the horizon where the midsummer solstice sun sets. So there's this sense that Durrington Walls as a complex forms a kind of opposite to Stonehenge, where the alignment, the key ones there are midwinter sunset, midsummer sunrise. This is midsummer sunset, midwinter sunrise. But perhaps the thing that really excited us was that not the avenue itself running down here, but what we were finding on either side of it. And you can see these funny things here that look a bit like fried eggs. They are house floors. And the egg yolk in the middle of them is the circular hearth. So these are plaster floors. The walls were made of wattle and daub, so they have long since disappeared apart from bits of the daub. And then they are surrounded by black organic layers of Neolithic filth. So we're talking about what would have been organic layers about this deep that are now compressed to so deep, and they're full of archaeological materials. So pottery, flint tools, animal bones, carbonized wood, carbonized plant remains. And the interesting thing about this material is that it's discarded in such quantity. The bones are often in articulation. This is the result of feasting. Normally when we dig a Neolithic settlement, we find our animal bones are crunched up, they've extracted the marrow, they've got every calorie of nutrition out of those bones before they've thrown them away. This is very different. This is actually eating a rack of ribs and chucking it. Not thinking, oh, we could boil that up for stew tomorrow. There's none of that. These are people that have got more than enough to eat. Classic sign of feasting. The houses are very simple. We're looking at a culture that is very different to the continent. We don't have any of those long houses by this point. They are square houses with rounded corners. They are only 5¼ meters in length. So they're really very small compared to what we have here and elsewhere in Europe. That's the sort of thing they would have looked like. And 3 of these houses are going to be built in the new Stonehenge Visitor Centre for next summer. So that's the time to go and visit it. Although they're so small, you can get 25 people in one of these houses, as we did. That's most of our team sitting in there. And this is something we did over this summer. And there's been a team of hard-working volunteers. Unfortunately, this lovely house has been pulled down because it didn't have planning permission. In this day and age, everything has to have planning permission. So all the hard work by a team of volunteers completely wrecked, but they seem happy enough to do it all over again. The area that we excavated, that you saw the photographs of, our artist has reconstructed, and we're largely kind of looking at this zone here, across the avenue, where we actually have unusual kind of buildings with one side open, looking down towards where the avenue meets the river. We think from reconstructing the results of early excavations that we have, the bit that we were looking at there is just here, but we've excavated in many other different parts of the site, as well as there being other excavations, and it looks as though we have a large 17-hectare settlement, quite possibly with an open area within the middle, and on the density that we've found where we've excavated, there may have been as many as 1,000 houses. It's organised around two kind of central points. One is this great southern circle. Woodhenge, by the way, is just up off the side of the picture. But also at the back here, we have a series of small henges, inside each of which there is a house. The main one of these has giant post holes out of the front of it, and it has a view of everything that's going on within the settlement. But the house itself is no bigger than any of the other houses that we've excavated. So although it might seem to be the site of whoever was in charge, it doesn't seem to have been any larger. The only difference, there are two differences, it has 4 big posts within the building around the hearth, and it's also an area that was kept very clean. So of course it raises the possibility that maybe it was some kind of cult house, nobody actually living there, or it could be somewhere where whatever was brought to the people living there, the rubbish was taken away and dumped somewhere else. So it's an unusually, surprisingly clean space. Unfortunately, it's not as well preserved as where we've looked elsewhere in the henge, so we can't be too sure exactly what condition it would have been in. So where was everybody coming from? Now the problem with Durrington Walls is it's very much a place of the living. There are no burials. So to carry out strontium and oxygen isotope analysis on tooth enamel, we can't do it with people from here because there aren't any. Well, there's one, which I'll come to in a moment. But what we do have is the animals. And we can see where they brought the animals from. And also, by looking at different rings in the teeth, we can also get an idea of how they're coming to this place, whether they're likely to be traded, in which case we would expect a break in their movement, so they get to Stonehenge, or the geology of Stonehenge, hang around for a few months or a year or so and are then killed, or if actually they're being brought straight to Stonehenge for slaughter. And that seems, the latter seems by far the most likely, that they're not trading them in, they're just bringing them for the party at Durrington Walls. Where are they coming from? Well, Stonehenge is in this bit of blue, just here. So the vast majority ought to have come from there. But actually, it's only a minority. It's that group at the bottom within the blue lines. More of them are coming from this area in green. These are Mesozoic sediments, and most of England is covered in that kind of geology. So it's a bit kind of useless for us because they could come from 20 miles away, just here, or they could come from right up here. Unfortunately, there's no way of telling. But things then get a bit more interesting when we look at the other. Oops, what's going on here? Types. Hang on, we went a bit fast there. There we go. So this group, and there's a lot of them, the nearest they could have come from is southwest England. This very small group, where is it? There we are. Oh, go on. There. That very small group, either from Wales or North Devon. And then this has been the real surprise. That group can only have come from Scotland. Most probably from the area that we call Aberdeenshire. An area that we know had dense Neolithic occupation at that time. So given that these are full, there's no part of the bone, the skeleton that is missing, it looks as though these came in as entire animals, presumably on the hoof. It seems a very long way to go. That's over 500 miles. It's the kind of distance that Ramilson would be familiar with in Madagascar, because that's how far people drive cattle today from the south of Madagascar up to the capital to take the cows to market. So it's by no means extraordinary, but it's still unusual. We've been used to much shorter distances for animals from all of our other sites that we've looked at in Britain from prehistory and indeed from the early historical period. Stonehenge stands out as completely different in geographical scale to any other sites we've looked at. As I said, what do we know about the people themselves? We have one tooth from Durrington Walls. Did it fall out in a fight? We don't know. Is it a bit of somebody's skull or whatever? Where does this one come from? And this comes from North Devon, or most likely Wales. So people are coming from some distance, just like the cows. We've also been trying another isotope, looking at oxygen 18. The results are not as clear cut as with the strontium. All we can say is that the ones in red and blue are the signals that we get from cattle in Orkney in the very north of Scotland. The yellow, so the green values, are from the east of England. And most of the Durrington Walls ones fit somewhere in between, not surprisingly. We've also got a project looking at the pigs and their strontium isotope levels, and the initial results show a very similar pattern to the cattle. I thought we would have all the pigs being local, because it's very difficult to herd pigs long distances. But no, we have pigs with extreme Scottish values in there, along with the cattle. Now the pigs are also quite good because they tell us a lot about how they're cooking. So we're getting some idea of Neolithic cuisine. They're shooting some of them with bows and arrows, which is strange because these are all domesticates. So it must be that British love of blood sports coming out. So presumably letting the pigs go and then way picking them off and then eating them. But to eat them, they're doing barbecue, and we have a very large pit, 5 meters long, outside of the southern circle, which appears to have been one of the main cooking locations. So we have burnt extremities of limbs to show that these animals are being barbecued. And I wonder if it's like today, all the men saying, oh, go on, out the way, come on. Yes, this is men's work, doing the barbecuing, and of course burning the meat horribly. I don't know. But they're also boiling, and they're boiling in these enormous vessels that are kind of about this big. Now, strangely enough, from our isotope, from our lipid analysis, do you know about lipids? Fatty acids? So looking at what was actually cooked in the pots, we can see that the little pots were used for milk, the middle-sized pots were for beef, and the big pots were for pork. So for some reason, the more communal the meal, the more the emphasis on pork rather than beef. Okay, that's enough of what's happening in this place of the living, and it's somewhere through radiocarbon dating we can associate this with stage 2 at Stonehenge. So we think this is where the builders were living when they put up the big Sarsens, so that main stage of Stonehenge. We can date it to less than 45 years through radiocarbon, and we also have evidence from the multiple plasterings of the floors to see that no plasterings were more than 8 times. If that's on a seasonal basis, that might suggest that they're there for less than 10 years. So is that the time that it took to actually build Stonehenge? The other thing we can see from the aging of the pig teeth is that there's a very clear concentration of pigs growing to around 9 months. We're fairly sure that they're giving birth in the spring and that most of them are being killed in the autumn and particularly the winter. Now, as you can see, there's a sort of standard, just a low level of killing all year round for these pigs. So going into the spring, the summer, the autumn, the next winter, to suggest that actually there may be a resident population at a low level which is augmented in the winter by large groups coming for feasting. So our guess is that it is the winter period that is the crucial time. So unfortunately, everyone who goes today for Stonehenge summer solstice is probably enacting the wrong time of year. But never mind, never mind. So what about Stonehenge itself? And in 2008, we excavated here to recover the remains of Stonehenge's dead. Because back in the 1920s, the archaeologist William Hawley excavated some 59 burials. And all the spots in red are where he found one or more burials. What happened? He threw them all away. But fortunately, his assistant kept them in bags in his attic. Yes? What is the French for attic? Right. And in 1935, he thought, we better put these somewhere safe. He'd offered them to museums and they said, no, we don't want any of that old rubbish. So he had to bury them in one of these Aubrey holes. So he and a colleague went to this one, number 7, in 1935, opened it up and put them all in. I was really hoping that they were good archaeologists who were thoroughly aware of context and would have individually wrapped each one in a durable material so that we'd be able to get them out, and maybe there'd be a label to say this one came from that location and that one came from over there. And of course you know what I'm going to say. They were all completely mixed up. They put a very nice little lead plaque just here. You can see the silhouette of where it lay, explaining what they were for eternity, for those archaeologists from the future. And it's quite a funny feeling being that archaeologist from the future, that I wasn't dressed in my spacesuit, I'm hovering and but there they were, and we were very disappointed, but not as disappointed as our osteoarchaeologist who has had to look through every single bone. And I mean, they're fragments about that big, and sometimes they're just that big. And she's had to identify body parts. And one of the key things has been to say, well, how many individuals can we identify from this group? Because then we can radiocarbon date each individual, knowing that we're actually not going to be dating more one skeleton more than once. Because if you just take a grab sample, just date the biggest, best bones, how many of them might actually come from the same person? So you'd expect to get 59 individuals, given there are 59 deposits. She didn't get anything like that. She got about 26. And 5 of them are subadults, so teenagers, children, infants, and all the rest are adults, split fairly evenly between men and women. So it's an unusual group because you ought to expect far more subadults for the levels of child mortality at that period. So there's definitely a preference towards adulthood for inclusion at Stonehenge. Here they are, all the radiocarbon dates set together. And when we combine all of those, that's our cemetery over time from that sample of just 26 individuals. So it's unlikely to be the full range, but it's giving us a reasonable idea of the sort of length of time that Stonehenge was a burial ground. And not just any old burial ground, but the biggest burial ground in the whole of Britain in the 3rd millennium BC. Now, given the sample that were excavated, we have just over 60, we have about 64 separate burial deposits. That's likely to be less than a half, probably less than a third of the total number of people buried there. Because we know that he excavated about half of the site, but we also know that those early archaeological excavations were done very poorly. In fact, we found, just re-excavating the 1935 pit, where they'd all been put back, right on the edge of it, we found another intact burial, which they'd completely missed. And we spotted it as soon as we took the turf off. So they cannot have been looking very hard at all back then. So I'm afraid they weren't very good, not very sharp-eyed archaeologists. But anyway, what we seem to have, the cemetery starting around here, around 3000, peaking 2900, and then dropping off, finishing sometime around or shortly after the second stage of Stonehenge. So a long-lived place of burial. Unfortunately, this is not a period where there are many grave goods. They weren't putting their cremations in pots, and they weren't providing much in the way of grave goods. They seem to have these pins, which may have been used for the shrouds that the corpses were wrapped in. Sometimes they're burnt, so they've been on the pyre. Other times they're not burnt. And we think that the deposits were made in small leather bags. And the cremation that we excavated intact, we could see that it had indeed been in a circular organic container. So a bag seems most likely. But the other artifacts of interest, and there are just two of them. One is a mace head, and the other is a small pottery vessel just here, which has a flattened surface with burning carbonized marks on its surface. I wonder if these might be symbols of authority, both religious and political. But that's as close as we can get to who those people actually were. And I assume they were quite special to be buried in Stonehenge. This wasn't somewhere that everybody had access to, I suspect. So let's sort of move into conclusions. Why build Stonehenge at that point? It's a strange time in British prehistory because we've had 1,000 years of the Neolithic. And it's a very different culture in the 4th millennium to what it becomes in the 3rd millennium for the time of Stonehenge. Because in the 4th millennium, Britain seems to be divided regionally in terms of material culture, both portable and monumental. So, for example, on the left here, we have the distribution of regional styles of ceramics. And on the right here, we have the distribution of regional styles of monument. So you could just go 10, 20 miles, 30 kilometers, and be in a completely different world to the one you had left. And doing that sort of thing may well have been a bit risky, because one of the things that we have is a lot of Neolithic clubbing. Now, by clubbing, I don't mean going out to the Neolithic disco. I mean hitting people hard with wooden clubs. And we have examples of these wooden clubs from peat bogs in northern England where they've actually survived. and we have 6.8 of the skulls examined in a study by Rick Schulting and Mick Wysocki, and they looked at over 300 of these. 6.8% had evidence of blunt force trauma. In half of those cases, the wound had at least begun to heal, but in the other half of those cases, those injuries were perimortem, so around the time of death, if not the actual cause of death. And you can see that there are certain areas, this zone here, either side of the Severn Estuary and in the counties of Dorset, Gloucestershire and Wiltshire, where it seems to have been a fairly dangerous place to go out if you didn't have your club with you, or even if you did have your club. Most of the injuries we find are on this side of the skull, and that's characteristic of a right-handed attack coming swinging in like that, face to face. They're equally divided between men and women as well. So women just as likely to get clubbed as men. It's a very different picture to what we see, for example, in the third millennium in Britain, where we have after 2400 BC the end of cremation and the rise of inhumation, where clubbing injuries are virtually zero. The other thing is 6.8% is very high. I was told on very good authority that if you counted up the number of people living in the 20th century who died in conflict or genocide, and there are millions and millions and millions, compared to the number of people who actually lived in that century, the percentage is less than 1%, which is quite extraordinary. So we may be looking at quite a rough time. In terms of other evidence, we have from two of our causewayed enclosures from around 3400 BC, we have evidence of conflict. Actual attacks on the causewayed enclosures. The best known of these is Hambledon Hill, where we have two young adult male skeletons buried, thrown into ditches, and in one particular case we've actually got an arrowhead within the chest cavity. So it looks as though this is a time when there are certain differences. You can't travel freely necessarily across the country. There's trade. We can see that stone axes are being traded, for example, but it may be that there were certain concerns if you went out further than you ought to. This, I think, starts to change after 3400 because we see new styles of material culture, both portable and monumental, which are actually across the regions. So kind of long distance contacts. Peterborough ware, this stuff up here, we find throughout southern England and Wales. Grooved ware, that starts up here in Orkney of all places around 3200. By 2900 it's already in use on the south coast, and it spreads basically the whole of Britain and Eastern Ireland. A very different situation to before. The houses, we'll come on to houses in a moment. The monuments that are then built are also very different. So instead of having continental inspirations, long barrows, dolmens, causewayed enclosures, we see some peculiarly British styles. The cursuses, these long, thin, almost like avenues, with just occasional small entrances into them, if any entrances at all. This is the Stonehenge cursus, which is nearly 3 kilometres long. But also the henges. So there's a sense that within Britain, there's a growing familiarity across long distances, what I would call a commonality of cultural practices. And it's kind of strange because this is actually the very time that Britain becomes isolated from the continent. It's only 22 miles to Calais. But a recent study by Richard Bradley, Colin Hazelgrove and Mark van der Linden has demonstrated that there is no evidence of any contact in this period between 3,400 and 2,400. Not until the Bell Beaker time do we actually get cross-channel connections, which is very strange. So there's a sense of a deliberately isolated, autocratic society with people class-riven, constructing massive monuments in their thousands. Meanwhile, on the continent, they're all giving up megaliths and other big earth-moving enterprises and going for a very different style of social organisation. Our houses at Durrington Walls, we can match those with houses like those at CReA-Patrimoine, where because they had chopped down all their trees, they had to build in stone. So we have stone furniture, but we know from our excavations that we've got the footings for the same kinds of furniture, like these dressers, like the beds, like the little sort of cupboard-like storage areas. So you can take the plan of our house, like this one here, and overlay it onto the plan of this one, and it is exactly the same in size, in shape, and in internal layout. The main difference is that in Orkney, the hearths are rectangular, a square, not round. And we have houses like these in Wales, in eastern England. It's the sense that there's a common domestic culture as well as a common ceremonial culture developing. So that's the context in which Stonehenge picks up. So what I'm wondering is if actually it's all about unification. Now, this isn't really a very new idea. It's an idea that keeps getting suggested and then forgotten. It was an area that was put forward first by a man called Arthur Evans, the man who discovered Knossos. It then appears again in the writings of someone called Gordon Childe, who you've also probably heard of, who published it the very year he went and jumped off a cliff in Australia, the year he retired. I guess he didn't have a very good pension plan. And then my old professor, Colin Renfrew, back in the 70s, suggested that Stonehenge was built by a confederation of chiefdoms. So, in their own ways, I think these are quite interesting insights. But I think the key thing that hasn't really been thought of, and it's this business about why bring those stones all the way from Wales. Now, there have been various theories. One recent idea is that they were seen to have healing properties, a theory developed out of a medieval legend about Stonehenge, that they were brought by Merlin and his men from Ireland, and they were a stone circle that had been put up by giants who had selected those stones for their healing properties, and Merlin says that's why you've got to have this stone circle to take to Stonehenge. For reasons I'll explain later, I think the healing hypothesis is probably in the wrong direction. The team that have been following that particular theory, to support their theory, they've been looking in one part of the Preseli Mountains where there are sacred springs and holy wells. We now know that they've been looking in the wrong area because of the geology of the stones. So I suspect that renders their hypothesis invalid. Anyway, why do they want stones from this area? What is so special about West Wales in the Neolithic? And one of the things that's interesting is it's one of our densest distributions of dolmens. Some of them may be very ancient. So we have a type of dolmen there called a closed chamber tomb of a sort that we normally expect to find in Brittany from just before 4000 BC. So just before the beginning of the British Neolithic. Because for some reason the British Neolithic takes a very, very, very long time to happen. You've got the Neolithic here around 5500 BC. We're looking at 1500 years later for it to get any purchase in whatever form in Britain. Strangely backward. So one possibility is that this part of Wales is one of the first areas to actually take the Neolithic package in whatever form it may be. Whether it's the part of prolonged interaction by coastal communities going up and down from Brittany into the Irish Sea, or whether it is the direct landing of groups bringing farming with them and inserting themselves in amongst the resident hunter-gatherer population. So one possibility we have is that compared to the traditional model, which sees agriculture moving in from the channel, so across from Calais to Dover effectively, we could have a different Neolithic, possibly an earlier Neolithic, but it also raises the issue that this might be a Neolithic with a different ancestry to that comes through LBK, linear band ceramic, and Michelsberg. That this is one that actually comes ultimately from the cardial-ware culture of the Mediterranean through the Breton Neolithic. So we could be looking at very different cultural ancestries. And with that, maybe different languages, maybe different senses of ethnicity, maybe different senses of genetic ancestry. All that yet to be found out. But it raises the issue that this may be part of a kind of divided Britain, not so much north-south, but in fact more northwest-southeast. And that what we're seeing in Stonehenge in its first phase is a sense of integrating the two sides, east and west, together into one. What have we got where we're looking in Wales? Craig Rosavellin, that's where we're excavating at the moment. And there's been a number of suspected sources, also shown in red, for other types of those bluestone rocks. And the main interest in the last 100 years has been on this area, particularly Carn Menin, which has been identified since 1923 as the likely source of the spotted dolerites, the most numerous of the bluestone types at Stonehenge. But recently, 2 weeks ago, our geologists published a paper in which they were able, from the chemistry, comparing spotted dolerite monoliths at Stonehenge to spotted dolerite outcrops here, to say that is not the place that they come from. 100 years of searching in that area was all misdirected. And of course this has been the outcrop at the centre of the healing theory. So I think to remove that, I think we now have to forget that particular theory. What it does mean, though, is that the focus is not just on the north side of Preseli, but on a single valley, running, starting here and here, joining there, flowing down past the rhyolite source to where it meets the larger river, the River Nevern. So what is special about that location? And one of the theories I'm thinking of is that maybe what these were doing was not providing stones for Stonehenge directly, but for their own stone circle. That the people of this region had their own ceremonial centre where these stones were put up as their symbol of their ancestral identity. And that what happened was that they were taken down and taken to Stonehenge. And we have somewhere that may just be the location for that stone circle. It's a multi-period site called Castell Mawr, and we were immediately drawn to it because although it's recorded as a hill fort, it has a bank on the outside and a ditch on the inside. What has a bank on the outside and a ditch on the inside? A henge. So we've focused on this. Its situation within the Nevin is on top of a hill, totally dominating the entire Nevin Valley. It's surrounded by Neolithic monuments, all of them here marked in red. And last year, our geophysical survey identified a series of palisade ditches inside them. This year, we excavated those features, and we're confident that we may well indeed have a stone circle there. So that's all for the future, and the key thing just to leave you with is I'm just the front man. We have a huge, wonderful team of experts in all kinds of things, and all I've really done today is to try and distill the huge amount of information that has been put together by all these people who have worked incredibly hard. And of course, thanks to the funding of various agencies, particularly the Arts and Humanities Research Council in Britain and also National Geographic. But something I learned very early is if you're going to tackle a super site like Stonehenge, you can't do it on your own. Thank you very much.